Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Brian Emerson with Local Futures. Before we get started, I'd like to make sure that you can all hear me okay. If you can hear me, please send a message saying so using the chat box. It's located in the upper right corner of the screen. Great. Great, it looks like at least most of you can hear me fine. If you can't hear me, our technical assistant, Sean, he's available to help. You can ask Sean for help by submitting another question in the chat box. You can also click on the happy face emoticon in the lower right corner and select the Need Assistant option. And in that same place, you can let us know if the presenter's volume needs to be increased or decreased. So let's get started. Again, my name is Brian Emerson with Local Futures. I'd like to welcome you all to the first webinar in our Global to Local series, hosted by Local Futures Director Helena Norberg-Hodge. The topic of today's webinar is Going Local, and Helena will be talking to author, lawyer, and economist Michael Shuman. Both Helena and Michael have received global recognition as pioneers of the localization movement and have been writing about the benefits of economic localization for decades. So we're really lucky to have both of them here today. We will start with the 45-minute conversation between Helena and Michael, and that will cover a range of topics related to localization. After this initial discussion, we'll open up for a question and answer period. We'll officially end after 1 hour, but can go over maybe 10 to 15 minutes if there are a lot of questions remaining after that. So if you do have a question, please type any questions into the chat box as in the upper right corner. You can submit your questions pretty much any time during the webinar, and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can during the Q&A. One final note, if for some reason your internet connection is weak, you can also call in and listen to the webinar by phone. And the phone number and instructions on how to do this are included in your registration confirmation email, where you can simply click the info button just above the chat box. So one last word, actually, this is the first time we've used the Click Meeting webinar platform, so we do ask for your patience in case we encounter technical difficulties. And with that, I'm going to enable the audio and video for our presenters and turn things over to our director, Helena Norberg-Hodge. That will just take a second.
Thank you, Brian. I hope people can hear me. As you can all tell, we're new at this. We'll get better at it as we go along. This is the first in our series, and I'm very happy to be talking to Michael, my dear friend and colleague, who is also the #1 economist in the worldwide localization movement. Thank you so much for doing this, Michael.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
Why don't we start off with your definition of localization?
Well, I think local is one of those terms that many people use and abuse to their own discretion. But I think, it's useful to think about 3 different ideas that are embedded in local. So one is the idea of proximity. The proximity between, say, farm to table, and keeping that as small and reasonable as possible. The second is local ownership. So if one can imagine between the farm and the table, there is the food processor and distributor and the retailer. You want as many of those businesses to be locally owned as possible, and we'll talk about the reasons for that. And then the third issue is character. You know, the character and culture of a community and preserving what is great about every place and the people in every place. And I think, you know, when you start to look at those three dimensions, you understand immediately why when a Walmart kind of company says, well, we now serve local food in the grocery department, why it's kind of a joke.
That's right. And for us, you know, working internationally, this is so clearly about allowing both biological and cultural diversity to flourish. And that diversity is essentially a principle of life. It's something that, to the extent that we, through the Walmartization of the world, destroy diversity, we destroy life. And we destroy the unique individual character of individual people, as well as their group, community, and cultural identity. And of course, the biosphere on which we depend. So from my point of view, we're really talking about a shift in direction away from a global monoculture to a diversity and a flourishing of life that is essential for our survival. And for me, it's quite important to talk about it as a shift in direction.
Helena, can I interrupt real quickly? It sounds, we're getting some feedback that you're not loud enough. Is there any way that you move closer to the mic?
Yes. Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was saying that the really important thing about localization is that by adapting to diverse ecosystems and cultures, we are changing our economic systems to essentially adapt to life. We are now getting to a point where this is beginning to become a question of survival, because we're here talking about reducing our ecological footprint, and we're talking about reducing the enormous damage that comes because one single consumer monoculture is being imposed on unique individuals and unique cultures across the world. And that monoculture, in destroying identity, the authenticity and uniqueness of the individual and of the group identity, lies behind terrorism and local ethnic friction. So for us, working from a global perspective, shifting away from global to local is essential for our survival and for of course, also for our well-being. And I like to think of it as being this shift in direction. We're not talking about an absolute. We are not going to be arguing that you all have to only buy local, eat local, be local. We're talking about a shift in direction to regain a balance. And this shift in direction is a systemic process that is taking place around the world, and we want to tell you more about it. Michael, over to you.
Yeah, and I think this shift of direction, it would be really hard for us in the localization movement if there were only the advantages to local culture and not the economic advantages to localization. It still may be a good reason to do it, but what I think we now can see is that actually the economy, the economics of doing local makes more and more sense. And there's a lot of different reasons for it. The most basic reason is that when people spend their money or whatever their mode of currency is within their own community, they affect the multiplier factor, which circulates the money in the community. And the more times the money circulates, the faster it circulates, the more income, wealth, and jobs. So every time a community unnecessarily imports an outside good or service, you are surrendering part of that multiplier effect, part of that economic well-being. And what is great news is that we are learning more and more about how to do more and more kinds of activities, at a small scale at a reasonably competitive price. And I think we have seen actually in the United States and in Canada, I think the increase of the competitiveness of local businesses. In some ways, in Canada, we have data, for example, on profit rates, and we know that the most profitable businesses in Canada have 10 to 20 employees, and it's about 30–40% higher than the profit rates of the firms that Canadians are totally bought into on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And it just underscores this incredible economic opportunity that many of us as investors are overlooking.
Yeah, and we have to remember too that when we're talking about external large investors investing into our local economy, they are always going to be looking to get more money out than they put in. And we're looking here, starting to build a circular model where the investors come from the local economy and where the money circulates within it. And so it's such a win-win-win for all the players. I mean, the examples also that we gave in the film, in the Economics of Happiness, you know, if you shop in a local bookshop as opposed to a chain store, and how the spin-off is that the local bookshop would use local accountants, local legal help, local advertising, and so the entire community benefit. Have you got some more examples and statistics about the economic success?
Yeah, so here's, in the United States, we have 3 different studies that have been done in the last, I don't know, 3–4 years. One study by a group of Harvard economists that shows that when you look at communities across the United States, those communities with the highest density of locally owned businesses actually have the highest job growth rates. And then when you look, and there's another study from our Federal Reserve in Atlanta that shows that when, again, when you look at this sort of regional spread of local businesses, those regions with the highest localization actually have the highest per capita income growth rate. So in other words, if you're interested in income equality, justice, getting rid of poverty, localization is really one of the most powerful ways of doing it. And there's a lot of interesting explanations for this. I think, you know, another piece of this that is implicit in localization is the creation of a relationship-based economy. I think part of the monoculture and the commodification that Helena talked about, part of what is so destructive about it, is that people have these very distant and impersonal relations between the makers of goods and the consumers, between the investors and the companies, between the businesses and the suppliers. And localization enables these relationships to become closer. Now, there is no perfect antidote to things going wrong in those relationships. Bad people exist at all levels. But what we know is that when people have close relationships, at least they try, many try, to behave somewhat more responsibly with one another. So that's why the triple bottom line that we're after of environmental stewardship and labor rights integrity, these things are often so closely tied in with localization.
Absolutely. I mean, for us, this rebuilding of the interdependence between people and the natural resources on which they depend it's the fundament of regaining our humanity, really. From our point of view, we evolved in groups, in community groups, intergenerational groups. Our time on this planet, we have been able to see the impact of what we do on the water, on the soil. It is just a tiny blip in our existence on this planet that we've been so distanced from both one another and from our footprint on the living earth that we become blind and stupid and extremely damaging and with it extremely unhappy. You it's when you look at it from the global point of view, the pattern is very, very clear. Of course, for me, the biggest thing that stands between us and a much healthier, happier world is that people are not getting the information. That's why I'm glad to be able to do this webinar. I hope it can reach more people. Just the facts that you have access to, Michael, these reports that show the economic benefits of localization, they're not headlines in the New York Times as they should be. I also feel that we need to remind ourselves that right now a larger and larger number of people are struggling to pay the mortgage. Parents are desperately worried about their children's possibilities of getting a decent job and being able to afford the housing in the proximity of those jobs. And so it's really vital that we stress the economic benefits, because as more and more people become economically insecure, they're often becoming less able to embrace the sort of green perspective or even worry so much about global justice. So I think we do have a very, very strong case, and we shouldn't shy away from stressing the economic benefits. But when we can highlight the multiple benefits, to me, it seems that we have an argument that's really unassailable.
Yeah, I think that this evidence has, if anything, has gotten stronger over time. I mean, one of the things I'm struck by, for example, is the proliferation of local food businesses. I mean, in the United States, and I think you can observe similar trends in Europe and Oceania, and even in developing areas of the world, that what used to be viable local food systems have gotten replaced by these kind of global distribution infrastructures with big shopping centers and grocery stores. And so now people, as they recognize the new economics of local food, are reinvesting and recreating this local infrastructure. But it's taking time, but you see it everywhere. I mean, I'm struck by that in every state in the United States, every town, independent of its politics, you're seeing the emergence of farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, local food, local restaurants. And I think it speaks to this not only working economically, but capturing people's imagination.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it gives me immense pleasure that I was early on pioneering this. And I remember so well, even in Los Angeles, San Francisco, where these things are now so widespread. It's only about 20 years ago that people would say to me, oh, Helen, this idea, but it's just not going to happen. People like to have their strawberries in winter, and you're just going against the tide of people's desire. And now I cannot tell you. I mean, Michael, I'm amazed because working as we do so internationally, I don't get back to a lot of these places every year. And I just returned to the German-speaking world a couple of years ago, and not having been there for 3 years or something, I was just amazed by how much is happening. And it is particularly around food. And I met the farmer who started the first CSA in Beijing recently, something called Little Donkey Farm. These are little seeds of just, they are jewels, and they are inspiring and healing. You know, many of these projects will be working with juvenile delinquents, with people who've suffered trauma. They're bringing, of course, into prisons. And this connection, this reconnection to nature, through being able to also be productive, actually engaging with nature in a productive way, has this incredible healing effect on us and on the environment. And of course, what happens too is that it starts to rebuild the community fabric. So we simply can't overestimate
the incredible benefits from this rapidly growing worldwide local food movement. And if I could just add to that, I think one of the things that we keep trying to stress is that there's a structural relationship between monoculture and long distances. The distant buyer can only deal with tons of straight carrots that fit the machinery all the way from the harvesting and the processing to the packaging and the supermarket shelves. As you shorten the distance, you're actually creating markets that not only reject monoculture, but that demand diversity. So inherently, as we shorten distances, we are moving to a market pressure that encourages ecological diversity and therefore ecological health. It's a structural way to go organic without having to necessarily, in some cases, it can be rather expensive to get the national standard for selling organic. So what's happening in the farmers markets is this natural process of diversification makes it very easy for farmers to simply abandon their dependence on chemical fertilizers and fungicides and pesticides. So it's a natural path to organic.
I think one of the sectors that you really can see this flourishing in the developed world is beer. Beer, ales, spirits. I mean, what's interesting about this is that there's kind of two trends that are going on, and I think this is true in many other sectors as well. On the one hand, there's massive consolidation. So Anheuser-Busch, one big brewery, is about to take over the Miller Company, and and just have a virtual monopoly on the big scale market. And then at the other end of the spectrum, every community is now creating its own microbrewery built around local tastes, local pride, and in a way they're kind of in a race with one another about which is going to prevail. And I think that one of the reasons why I think the locals are going to prevail is that the technology for doing microbrews has really become quite widespread. The knowledge is spreading. And that spread of knowledge, know-how, is a lot of what I see our work is doing in creating international network. Because, just like the people on this webinar today are from all over the world, there are businesses all over the world, say in a field like beer production, that are in communication with one another. And if we just are a little bit more deliberate about that, we can help all kinds of sectors in our economy become more competitive. And I think global companies have been doing this kind of collaboration, some would say collusion, for years. And it's, about time that their local competitors around the world do this. And I think that has been a game changer on the effectiveness of local businesses.
I agree with that, and I also think it's incredibly important that, as it were, the consumers or the civic society, people concerned about the environment, concerned about poverty, and concerned about their economic survival, exchange much more information across boundaries, which are actually in the mainstream media. We have to be aware that we are not getting the transference of knowledge that we need. I am astounded by the lack of information between countries. So even in between Sweden and Norway, where people may have worked for decades to build up an environmental profile, those environmental voices will be heard within the national arena, but they don't get translated into the neighboring country. I remember about a decade ago being amazed at how many American environmentalists didn't know of David Suzuki, who was a household name in Canada. And then I found out that in Canada, really well-informed environmentalists hadn't heard of Bill Moyers, who was a household name in America, as a leading voice for sanity. So there is this much greater need for international communication, exchange, and support at all levels than we realize. And this is why we put such an emphasis on what we call education as activism and international collaboration for localization. We also want to encourage people to take a rather complicated but not so difficult path where they practice both what we call resistance and renewal. Sometimes we get people who feel, okay, we know the problems, let's just focus on the solutions and let's just focus on action. We've heard enough talking, don't need any more of that, let's just get on with doing something. We feel that in this climate of a lack of information, including the information about what Michael was telling us about, all the various statistics that show how much more effective local business is in every way that we care about, that information isn't getting out. So there's just this huge vacuum and need for activism through talking, actually, through spreading information, through getting your email list activated and sending around links to websites, sending out email newsletters, and gathering locally. So we'll come back to that, but I want to also address yet another reason for needing education as activism, and that is that not only are we up against a system that quiets all the good news, that keeps that silent, we basically don't see what I'm calling a silent revolution from the bottom up. We need to highlight that, give it a voice, but we're also getting active opposition. We're getting a lot of corporate think tanks coming out with ideas that undermine local. And that has included all kinds of studies that said, for instance, oh, don't think that buying local food reduces CO2 emissions. No, it's actually better in England if you buy your lamb from New Zealand than buying it from the UK, because New Zealand lamb is produced using renewable energy, and in the UK we use coal and oil. Many studies like that undermine the truth and counter the reality of what's going on. Another favorite myth is that localization is elitist, because it's not always possible for businesses to be competitive enough to be able to offer a price that's as low as Walmart. So you can often find, something produced in China costing a lot less than something in a local market, and therefore it gets painted as this middle class elitist movement that if you care about the poor, if you care about poverty, you should be going against. I'm sure you have some of those examples too, Michael.
Yeah, so, I mean, here's one thing to think about, which is if it were really true that local goods and services were shoddy, less competitive, the result of a buy local campaign would be totally counterproductive, because once people experience the more expensive and less quality local goods, they would never come back to them. And in fact, what we can see is that the impact of a buy local campaign is always just the opposite. It always increases people's attraction and connection with local goods, because what we're really doing, and in a group that I worked with for many years, BALI, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, we use the expression not buy local, but think local first. That is, every time you're making a purchasing decision or an investing decision, really look at the full range of alternatives out there. And if you do so, the key is not price. No one makes a decision just on price. If they did, things like Starbucks coffee would never exist because it's the most expensive cup of coffee out there. People make their decisions based on value. And even people with very limited money and limited education, know a good value from a bad one, and that's one reason why even in very poor areas, local food has taken off, because people see the value of that.
Yeah, and I think that we have seen so many instances where when we tried to start a new farmers market or something, there were so many objections. Whether it was the local shop owners who thought it was a threat, the local government weren't keen to support it, even the farmers sometimes thought this was a crazy idea to suddenly start selling in just some open market. But again and again, what you see is that once these things start, people love it and it goes from strength to strength. And so I think the main thing that we want to share on this webinar is that there is a mass, I mean, just a revolution going on from the bottom up. And yet, you yourself will probably be amazed if you start looking around your city, your area where you live, and trying to identify what's going on at the grassroots. Because the media isn't telling you about it, the internet is often so crowded with so much that it's hard to follow what's going on, especially locally. So if you really start opening your eyes and looking around, you'll find there are a lot of really exciting projects to connect to support, to help strengthen. And one point I wanted to mention too about the myths that often is, you know, played up a lot is the idea that if we localize in the Western industrialized world, we're depriving people in the so-called poor world, in the developing world so-called, of a market, and that's a way of being irresponsible and not caring about the poor. If we start building up local economies in our own areas, first of all, that's not some kind of boycott. It doesn't happen overnight. So that gives the time and the space for producers on the other side of the world to diversify and localize themselves. The idea that most of the producers in most of the third world benefit from this long distance trade is a complete illusion. It is the giant middlemen, the traders, who benefit from it, not the people we care about. So supporting localization in both the global north and the global south is the way forward. And this is what we're trying to do in the International Alliance for Localization. We're trying to build up a network from individuals from every continent, members from every continent, to share information, to counter these myths, and above all, to help strengthen these positive alternatives.
I think our objectives are partially to help communities become as self-reliant as is possible. Now, there are limits to that, but by, as I explained earlier, by becoming more self-reliant, you add to income, wealth, and jobs. And from that, you then have the ability to buy other goods and services from outside your community that maybe you don't have the ability to make. And I think, trade still exists in a more localized world, but that trade becomes smaller, it becomes more benign, and hopefully the traders themselves and the trade, the trade transactions is primarily among locally owned players. And I could say, yeah, we're interested in fair trade, but frankly, I think fair trade doesn't go nearly far enough. I just started working with a coffee importer here in Maryland in the United States, where I work, named Blessed Coffee. It's an Ethiopian expatriate, and his vision, which I think is a beautiful vision, is that the farmers in Ethiopia should own the distribution company and own the coffee houses in the United States alongside of communities. And I starting to play with new forms of ownership to increase the many stakeholders involved in our economic well-being is, I think, a way not only of making our communities wealthy, but building this world fabric of communities that are really sensitive and in harmony with one another.
And I think that when we look at the contrast between what we're talking about and what we're doing and what's happening in the dominant system, the picture becomes stronger and clearer. What we're seeing is that the dominant path whereby governments are deregulating and subsidizing global trade, what they're actually doing is subsidizing the Walmarts and the Coca-Colas and the Monsantos of this world. And it's not about good guys and bad guys. I mean, for me, it's so clear that this is mainly happening because of blindness. There's a dogma about free trade being somehow associated with freedom. We don't realize that this path, which is also about deregulating banks, is leading to what we might call financial fascism. It is a playing field that is so unjust, so unfair. And then one of the elements in all of this that many people may not know about yet is that in deregulating banks and corporations, governments are signing on to treaties where they say, yes, you can sue us if we do anything that will impede your profit-making potential. So you have things like a Swedish nuclear power plant, Swedish nuclear power corporation suing Germany for 3.7 billion euros because they decided to phase out nuclear after Fukushima. You have Philip Morris threatening and suing even tiny countries like Togo if they dare do anything to impede their profit-making potential by putting a warning about cigarette smoking on the label of the packaging. So you have a system that favors these monopolies, and the absolute truth is that the net result is insecurity and unemployment for the majority, and a massive increase in energy consumption and other scarce resources. So we are talking about the absolute necessity to shift direction. And if I could just add again that, I've witnessed personally, both in Bhutan and Ladakh, that when you have a dominant system, a global monoculture that robs men in particular of their self-respect, of their identity, and this is to do with the cultural destruction, and at the same time, this system robs them of the ability to provide for themselves and their family. I've seen personally, this is a recipe for violence. This is what lies behind the fundamentalism and the violence we're seeing around the world. So this shift towards local is about a transformation. It's about a cultural transformation. It's about a spiritual transformation. It's about regaining those deeper connections to life that are very real, but in our distant, long-distant monocultural system, we become oblivious to them. We become oblivious to life itself. We actually become oblivious to ourselves. We are not able to function as fully human beings. So,
I agree about this issue of the subsidies as well, and they come in many, many different ways. In the United States, for example, we have data from the New York Times about 3 years ago that economic development at the state and local level is spending $80 billion per year in the name of economic development, but really to attract and retain non-local businesses, the effect of which is to make local businesses less competitive, which is the antithesis of economic development. And then we've got laws regarding investment that just make it really hard and expensive for the 99% of non-wealthy people to put their retirement savings into local businesses. Now, we've begun to change that a little bit in the United States and some other countries, but we're just at the beginning of it. And you can think of these laws as a massive subsidization of Wall Street and its equivalent worldwide, because it just sort of forces people, because they don't have any other options, to put their savings into big corporations. And the last point I would mention is, 25, 50 years ago, in many of our countries, we had really strong antitrust laws to break apart big monopolies. I mean, this was really big 100 years ago. And we seem to have given up on that. We seem to now ignore the laws, repeal them, and what's happening is then field after field, these giant companies are ruling big parts of the marketplace, and again, undermining competitiveness. So all of these things are tremendous costs that we're paying for right now until we actually create a level playing field for local business.
So it means that we're actually using our taxes to subsidize our own unemployment and to subsidize pollution. And Michael, why don't you tell us about your 6 Ps? First, I also just want to stress how incredibly exciting and positive it is that despite these huge subsidies, despite this enormous wealth and pressure in the opposite direction, that there is this groundswell of localization happening, which to me, makes it even so much more exciting and so much more powerful to know that that's going on despite the weight of the 99%, really. The 1% is basically carrying out this quiet revolution. And how do your Ps play into that?
So these 6 Ps are, and I've written about these in the last 2 books that I have, but it's just to create a very simple checklist for how to do local economic development, and just to run through them very briefly so that you can think about how this might apply in your own community. There's planning, that is to identify all of those places where people living in your community are unnecessarily buying outside goods and services, because that's where your resources are leaking out. And if you could plug those leaks with new kinds of local business, that's new wealth. People is about the entrepreneurship training to try to get locals to lead these new leak-plugging businesses. Partnerships are links or alliances among local businesses, so they're more competitive as a team than they would be operating by themselves. Purchasing is about getting people to buy more local more of the time, the think local first we talked about before. Purse is about local investment. Now, those of us without a lot of means can't really think very deeply about that, but those of us with extra savings should really try to figure out how to put those savings in local banks, other financial institutions, and local investments. And then finally, there's public policy at all levels. And I think one can be very ambitious about public policy, but given what we just talked about with subsidies, I think you can also have a very modest public policy which says our goal should be to stop destroying local business. If we could get our governments to do that, that would be a huge step forward.
Well, exactly, and I do think things are coming together around these trade treaties as people are waking up to this insanity of corporations being able to sue governments if they do anything to impede their power. And corporations are positioning themselves now as rulers of the world. Someone sent me a report recently, where essentially spelled out, corporations are the ones that are running the world, and it's positioned as saying they are the ones who have to solve our social and ecological problems, because governments are too poor, they're too indebted, they've lost jurisdiction over the global economy, and they're not able to attract labor, basically, because they're too poor. So we're in a situation now where we're either going to choose to have financial fascism and monoculture, or we're going to be starting to look at this path towards regaining our humanity, regaining diversity, regaining human scale control where it makes sense. It's about decentralizing, it's about shortening the distances, and paradoxically, one of the very best ways to see how this can work and why it's necessary is to have a more international perspective. And it's going to best happen, and probably only happen, if we collaborate more internationally. And we really hope that most of you are listening will follow up on these ideas, that you'll stay in touch with us, that you'll join the Alliance. Perhaps you would want to start a group in your own local area. We have a program developing local workshops that you can do based on this perspective. You can take our film and use it as a mini conference. In many communities, they take the film The Economics of Happiness and show that, and then they have a local panel of local players who are starting to do things. And there's also possibility of organizing a full-fledged international conference where some speakers come in or perhaps join you by Skype. So we really hope that people will feel from this little taster that that there is something to be gained, but more than something, there is this incredible solution multiplier in localization that is already bringing together people who previously were operating from a more single issue perspective. It's bringing together people who are concerned about climate, people who are concerned about poverty and unemployment, people who are concerned about democracy and justice. And this is our big hope, is this coalition of a coming together such as we have never seen before. Many people feel disheartened by the fact that so many people did march against the Iraq war. Still happened. It looks like governments are simply not listening, and many people are losing heart, they're losing their faith in change at the level of government. Even worse, a lot of people are simply saying humanity deserves to destroy itself. We're just nasty, greedy species, and if we destroy ourselves, it's probably better for the rest of the planet. This is so sad and so misguided when you look closer to the ground around the world and see those countless, absolutely millions upon millions of people who are still trying to make the world a better place. And you see how people thrive when they're able to be part of a community, when they're able to cooperate. You see how happiness increases through connection, localization. It's really worth giving it a go. And we look forward to hearing from all of you now for a few questions.
Great. Thank you, Helena and Michael, for a stimulating and wide-ranging discussion. So I just wanted to remind everyone, if you have a question, you can send it to us through the chat box in the upper right corner. We've already received a number of very good questions. The first one, I've actually put two together. Their focus is investment, so I suspect they might be directed towards Michael. First, from Japan, do you have an example of local investment structures in which eaters and growers work together to build local community-based food processing? And then I'll just give you two on investment together. Please comment on the new investment equity crowdfunding opportunities and their impact on the local economy.
Right. So in the United States, the organization that has taken the lead in promoting local investment is called Slow Money. And their objective is initially, at least, to get 1% of investment portfolios into small farmers, local food businesses. And so if one looks at Slow Money across the United States, and there's probably, I don't know, 3-4 dozen chapters across the United States, many of them have created some of these investment structures that you were asking about, bringing together eaters and growers, or and I think, for example, in Boulder, Colorado, there was a local investment fund created to support local food businesses. There are many investment clubs that have been put together, like No Small Potatoes in Maine, that bring together groups of small investors that, in an informal way, are doing small loans to farmers. What we're going to start seeing is more and more internet-based portals that bring together investors and businesses. And there's a great website in the US called Credibles, which allows you to buy in advance from local food businesses in bulk. And because of those bulk advance purchases, it is effectively like a investment, only it doesn't require the same legal paperwork, and it facilitates the growth of the related local food businesses. In terms of the crowdfunding, it has been a whirlwind of change here. 3 years ago, President Obama signed into law a equity crowdfunding bill called the Jobs Act, and it was not until about 3 weeks ago that our regulators finally gave the big thumbs up to say, okay, now you can start doing it. And so in May of 2016, this is going to start happening. But in the meantime, you know, in the US, we see 30 states that have created similar laws. And, you know, without getting into all the technical detail about it, what's, I think, very positive, at least especially about these state laws, is that it does enable small businesses to raise relatively modest amounts of money with much smaller legal bills. And you know, I, as an attorney, the last group that I want to get richer is attorneys. And if we can pull lawyers out of this process a bit, we can, I think, improve the efficiency of crowdfunding. So this is a huge development that, you know, over time is going to lead to a massive shift of capital away from global corporations back to local business.
Michael, can I just ask you, are you seeing actually that already now, these you say at the state level, that you can see this happening?
Yeah, so what's happened is that these laws have all gone on the books within the last, well, 3 years. So it started with the federal law, but really it's been mostly over the last year. So there hasn't been an enormous amount of activity, but I would expect that it's going to pick up quite dramatically. So in a way, the table has been set. Now the meal is going to be served.
Great. So this next one focused on food. It says there is a move here in Australia to make farmers markets illegal on the basis that they will affect the profitability of large supplier supermarkets. This could be just beginning if the TPP is ratified. Sort of a comment, but maybe Helena, you would be interested in commenting on that?
Well, I mean, I agree. I think that if there's an attempt to do so, I think we would see a lot of resistance, but we should be aware that we need, again, that education as activism, that information to build up more people power to shift things in the right direction.
Okay, the next question, are there some things that are better suited for local, e.g. food, energy, clothing, versus, say, things we will always need to get from beyond the local community, like certain technologies or medicines?
Yeah,
I think without a doubt, don't you, Michael? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can make that case, but here's what's, I think, remarkable. So in the U.S., we've got a database of all businesses that has the awkward name NACE, North American Industrial Classification System, and it has 1,100 sectors of business in it. And if you ask the question, in how many of these 1,100 sectors do we have more examples of successful, competitive, large business than small business? The answer is a whopping 7. That is, in 1,093 categories, we can see really great examples of competitive small business. And even in those 7 categories, like number 3 on the list is missiles and rockets. Actually, I can point out to you some locally owned missile companies if that's what you want to go into. So the point is that as a local economic developer, if you figure out there are sectors you want to become self-reliant in, the smart person looks around the world for great models of small-scale success, learns from them, and puts those in your own community. And if you do that, there's very little you cannot do cost-effectively.
I do just want to slightly stress that in terms of working in the global south, you sometimes have to be a little bit careful about importing models from elsewhere. So particularly when
No
this
missiles.
question,
Okay.
yeah. Well, it's also even in terms of food production, food particularly lends itself to localization, and there the adaptation to the specifics of climate, the specifics of soil, and to the diversity of the living world means that it really is a lot about the experimentation and the observation about those specific details. And of course, there are many things that you can learn from elsewhere to sort of import, particularly in terms of the business model. Even there, though, we want to see as much as possible an adaptation to cultural diversity. But yes, I would certainly think that there is this sort of hierarchy of needs in terms of what to focus on for localization. We can see that traditionally people imported and exported across the world. I mean, even in traditional Ladakh, they had coral, and especially coral, I think, came from Italy. And so things that were part of their wealth creation and that were not going to perish as they were transported over long distances, it was fine to have a trade in those things. But above all, what we want to see is that worldwide people have the right to develop and strengthen their self-reliance in food. People should have the right to have their basic needs come from relatively close to home and have the ability to have that the richness also of production at that level. Because, by the way, small diversified farms provide among the most enjoyable livelihoods of anything you can do. And there is a very exciting new farmers movement emerging across the world where people are leaving their practices as lawyers, as doctors, as bankers, and decide to farm because they really find that one of the most enjoyable things they can do.
Great. Maybe we have two more short questions, and then we can wrap up the official webinar. And then for those who have time to stay on, maybe for another 10 or 15 minutes, we can get to some additional questions if there are some that remain. The first question then is let's see, where did it go? Basically, how can we make sure that local consumption does not become just a niche for wealthy people?
Michael, do you want to take that?
Well, I think it comes back down to just continuing to do what we are doing already. It's not like local businesses occupy that niche right now. Local businesses occupy every niche, and I think that we community by community, you need to look at what you're importing and what's leaking out of your community and plug those leaks. And invariably, those leaks are biggest for low-income communities. The shopping malls are sucking in, and gas stations and other global corporations are sucking in these dollars and then exporting it. So that to the extent that one can localize more of the food and localize more of the energy and make that broadly available for people, that is going to do well for the economy and do well for equality. And again, I think that's why statistically we can see in the United States that local business communities are actually doing a better job at eradicating poverty. And
also, I'd like to add, I do think it's helpful to raise awareness about the fact that our taxes are subsidizing in a systemic way the long distance transport, and that comes through investments in global infrastructure and a whole series of things. But if we can get out the message that food from the dead old food from the other side of the world costing less than fresh, local, healthy food is a question of hidden subsidies and deregulation. So at least we can do away with this idea that our approach is elitist. That is an elitism that favors global corporations over humanity, basically. And so when we can frame it within the context, the accurate context of what's happening, we can do away with this idea that it's an elitist niche.
Great. So for the last question, it says, I am working on urban agriculture in my home city and find there's a real lack of understanding and communication at the level of planning. Planners are concerned with housing, infrastructure, and growth. How do we engage in politics to safeguard land and scale up for institutional support?
Michael, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I'll add, I think actually both of us probably have some experiences with this. And so right now, I am in the early stage of a project working with low-income communities across the United States and connecting them with work on urban agriculture that has been done by the university in the District of Columbia. And for those of you who don't know, Washington, D.C. is a really poor community, poor city in the greater United States, mostly African American, a little bit Latino. And what I see happening is that if we create a couple of demonstration projects like UDC is doing, interesting greenhouses, interesting urban farms, interesting farmers markets that sell the things that come out of this, and then we train young people, both in high school and at college level, to kind of get experience in these different kinds of projects and start taking people on tours of these things. It expands the imagination. I mean, I can't tell you how many kids come to these projects and you know, they've never been to a farm. They never have a concept like where their tomato comes from. And so when they come to a farm and see not only that, but it's happening right in a dense urban neighborhood, I think that's really inspiring. So I think creating models and bringing in participation is sort of a key way of legitimating and spreading urban farming.
I agree, and I also think if you're trying to work wherever you are now, that you could perhaps depend on some of the really good films that have been made, examples of other projects to show some of these planners. But it is also about forcing this rethinking. It's again about this sort of big picture activism of rethinking ideas to get them to open up their minds to the fact that food is the only thing human beings produce, that every person on the planet needs every day, and that this sector of the economy has been neglected, has been relegated to this relatively unimportant sector, and has been forced to comply with the needs of industrial production. You know, there's a massive evidence now that industrial green revolution agriculture is the biggest contributor to CO2 emissions. I mean, particularly as a global food system. And we are now getting UN studies, we're getting studies that we've been sponsored by the World Bank that are saying that green revolution industrial model didn't work. We've got to rethink food and farming at the center of rethinking a healthy economy, fuller employment, lower environmental impact. So it's a wealth of information that you could use, you know, to try to convince the planners you're dealing with.
Great. Well, with that, I just want to thank everyone for their questions. We'd like to thank both of our presenters for a really stimulating webinar, and of course, all of you attendees for participating. We will send out an email with a link to the recording of this webinar, a short survey, an announcement of future webinars, and some additional information. And for those of you who need to leave now, thanks again for your participation, and Helena and Michael, if you're ready, we can continue with a few more questions.
Okay.
Yeah? Okay.
Sure.
So we have one question. Should we be pushing for a shift in taxes from fossil fuel to labor? No, the other way around. The other way around.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Yes.
Absolutely. We have no idea what an enormous difference this would make to our lives. You know, it would actually be part of, I mean, the localizing path is also a path of slowing down. It's a path of moving away from ever increased on, not just on technology, but on technological systems that are coming to dominate us. You know, there are now places where old people are being helped by robots. And so all the time we're talking about displacing people and replacing them with technology, and that means energy, that means pollution. So yes, huge, absolutely enormous impact on our lives if we were able to accomplish that. You want to add to that, Michael?
Well, so I mean, there's kind of an amusing footnote to all of this. So now that Paris is, underway with climate change discussions, ExxonMobil, to show how visionary it is actually pushing for a tax shift itself right now. So, it seems to me that really what's standing in the way are old thinking of politicians, and it's not just fossil fuels. I mean, there's a lot of bads, everything, from pollution to the use of non-renewable materials. But I think that shifting our taxes away from, labor and onto these bads is a really sensible shift.
Okay. Michael, we have another question about investment. It says, what investment structures, and I'm guessing this means community investment structures, are available in Canada?
Well, Canada's got some great stuff going on. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of things that I've seen. So in Alberta, the province enacted an investment cooperative law so that people can form cooperatives, put their money into the cooperatives, and then use those cooperatives to invest in other local businesses. In Manitoba and in New Brunswick, they have tax credits for every dollar that you invest in a local business, you get a discount on your payment of provincial taxes. In New Brunswick, this is now 50%. So basically, you save half your. If you were to figure out, your tax bill is $10,000, you can put, $10,000 instead in local business. You get $5,000 off on your taxes. That is huge. In Nova Scotia, in 1998, there was the creation of what's called Community-Economic Development Investment Fund Act. And basically it made it possible for grassroots groups to create their own neighborhood funds, and then you get tax credits if you put money into those funds, and you also can put your tax-deferred pension savings into those funds. So almost $100 million has come into these funds. There's about 65 of these funds so far. So I think that in many ways Canada has these fabulous examples that we should all be looking at.
Hopefully now with Trudeau, they could be expanded even further. Mm-hmm. Maybe Canada is the leading country in localization. I mean, it's certainly right up there, isn't it, Michael?
Well, and you have this weird phenomena that the most conservative province, Alberta, recently came under NDP, New Democratic Party, leadership, and so all kinds of things are happening in unexpected places.
Yeah.
Great. So this next question In some ways, it gets at the question of the internet, something I know you're very interested in, Helena. We're wanting to develop software to link together locally committed businesses and social enterprises in our region. This is Northland, New Zealand, so that they can trade with one another and also the public can access locally focused goods and services. Clive, who asked this question, says maybe this has already been done already elsewhere, and they want to sort of avoid reinventing the wheel. But maybe you can both respond to whether or not you know of this, if this has been done elsewhere, but also maybe talk about the broader issues of the use of the internet in this movement.
Well, I hope Michael has some positive examples. I want to warn about focusing too much on building up those bigger connections without having some solid, much more local players. And so again, if there is a solid local food base, which a lot of which can happen without the internet, we tend to forget that, you know, we used to use all kinds of other modalities, including some flyers and leaflets and local meetings and radio, community radio. And I don't think we should abandon those in favor of the internet. There is a sense often that it's somehow the internet that's going to save us. It can be used as a tool, and maybe, Michael, you know of some examples where they have developed some software along these lines. But again, I have seen quite a few attempts to build up local food initiatives, you know, sort of starting with a website and the internet side, and in many cases, they fizzled out, whereas some of the more hands-on things of, you know, actually identifying specific farmers, specific players, supporting the local businesses and local players in a more face-to-face way has, in my experience, often worked better. What about you, Michael?
So I think, you know, the internet, like many tools out there, you can find good, bad, and mixed uses of it. And so you know, the answer of it depends on the details, I think, is very, very relevant. I mean, clearly, things like Amazon and you know, big trading platforms for Wall Street, you know, E-Trade, Ameritrade. I mean, these things have weakened, harmed local communities, local retailers, and, you know, I think there are some policy things that we can do to limit the damage that they do, but in that sense, the internet has been very harmful. I do think that there are some interesting examples of where local companies have creatively used the internet to facilitate different pieces of local economy building. So, for example, in Phoenix, Arizona, there is a distributor called PickFly, which helps to do direct delivery from local producers to people who can't get out of their homes and go to stores. They're elderly, they're disabled, they're single parents, and I think it's a great service and a great business. Across the United States and Canada, there's a company that puts up websites to facilitate connections between local consumers and local businesses, and has figured out some models to do that have really been very empowering for the businesses involved in that. There is a group based in Portland that I work with called Supportland. They have a loyalty card that's internet-based that every time you use it at a local business, you get discounts at future purchases at local businesses. And there are 80,000 residents of Portland that are now carrying this around. And it's a great business, and it's been very helpful in supporting local businesses. So I don't think one wants to overly romanticize this, because it is a very mixed picture. But where I see the internet working best is as a tool that reinforces the relationships that are embedded in a local economy anyway.
Great. Well, we got to most of the questions. I wondered if Helena or Michael, you want to just give some last parting words.
I want to say how much I enjoy working with you, Michael,
Yes,
and how
it is a great pleasure.
fabulous your work is.
Well, thank you. And I should say, so those of you who are on this call, some of you have come to the conferences, these economics of happiness conferences that we've had. You've had 6 of them now?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I feel like what we've learned from these conferences is a number of things. How many people are interested in this? How many people are tired of throwing bricks at the global machine and really want to build something constructive that's different in their own backyard? And this is the way of doing so. And also, I think how many different perspectives there are on local. And I know each time I've been to these conferences, I've just been amazed to different facets of what's important to people locally in their own economy just vary so widely. So this movement is about learning. It's about learning about the planet in a way and its cultures in a way that you could never do on your own. So I just invite you all to join us any way that you can.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. And again,
yes, join the economics of happiness. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you both, and thank you everyone for joining us. We will again send that email with the recording as well as some additional information. And for those questions that we did not manage to get to, I can also include some answers to those in the email. So thanks again, everyone.